Welcome to lecture number 89. This is historical topic 8.6, Early Steps in the Civil Rights Movement, 1940s and 1950s. The theme is social structures because it covers the way in which different groups in society are treated and the hierarchies that are created. There are two civil rights lectures in this unit, and the second one will cover the civil rights movement from the 1960s through the end of the period. The learning objective says, explain how and why the civil rights movement developed and expanded from 1945 to 1960. The first key concept says, seeking to fulfill Reconstruction-era promises, civil rights activists and political leaders achieved some legal and political successes in ending segregation, although progress towards racial equality was slow. To be clear, what the civil rights movement was trying to confront was Jim Crow laws that instituted segregation across the South, but also their disenfranchisement despite the 15th Amendment and the lack of economic opportunities or social mobility and threats of violence to their lives. Jim Crow laws created separate facilities for African Americans and whites. These were instituted by state and local laws. Because they were instituted and implemented by either city or state governments, this is referred to as de jure discrimination. It's a Latin phrase that means according to the law. Jim Crow laws were declared to be constitutional in the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson. It established the separate but equal doctrine, meaning that as long as separate facilities were provided for African Americans, then the establishment or business in question was not infringing upon a person's 14th Amendment right of equal protection under the law. Something else that the civil rights movement faced was disenfranchisement or the curtailment of voting rights. This was also done through the state laws. The 15th Amendment had guaranteed the right for all male citizens in the U.S. to vote. However, states created situations that made it harder for African Americans to register and exercise that right. These laws were gradually implemented after the end of Reconstruction, and it undid the progress that Reconstruction had achieved. African Americans had elected black senators and representatives to the U.S. Congress and various state legislatures. But as their ability to vote was limited through the poll tax, literacy tests, and intimidation tactics, black Southerners had less say in their elected officials. Their lack of representation in state government also opened the door for more discriminatory legislation to be passed. There was also discrimination in housing, banking, and employment. The previous lecture covered how the full benefits of the GI Bill were less often enjoyed by black veterans due to discrimination in the mortgage industry or education. In the North and in the South, African Americans were often not able to secure mortgages because banks wouldn't lend to black borrowers. If they were able to get a bank to lend them money, the FHA was less likely to insure their mortgage because they could often only buy in areas that were deemed risky, and that was the result of restrictive covenants in the deeds of houses that prohibited the sale of a house to a non-white buyer. To add to all of these institutional barriers to equality, there were groups independent of the government called white citizen councils that organized to further suppress African American votes through violent and economic harassment. And when the order came from the Supreme Court to desegregate schools, they opened up white-only private schools to get around the ruling. The logo of the councils incorporated the Confederate flag over the words states' rights and racial integrity. There is some overlap between the councils and the KKK, but the councils were supposed to be the more mainstream option, even though there were plenty of documented cases of violence by council members. Membership in the councils were more public and included Southern politicians, which gave the citizen councils more political influence than the KKK. Finally, violence was a constant threat to African Americans, but it was made worse by the impunity granted to those who carried out the violence, even when violent offenders confessed or were known to law enforcement. The two most egregious cases of this are that of Emmett Till and Recy Taylor. In 1944, Recy Taylor, a sharecropper in Alabama, was kidnapped while leaving church and gang-raped by 6 white men. The men confessed to their actions, and despite that, 2 grand juries declined to indict the men. Rosa Parks, then an NAACP field secretary, was sent by the organization to investigate the inaction of the local police department. Not only was there no justice ever carried out, but Taylor received death threats after the first grand jury, and her house was firebombed. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was visiting family in Mississippi. He was accused of offending a white woman, which led to his kidnapping, torture, and lynching. 3 days after his abduction, Till was found in a river. His head had a bullet wound through his right ear, and his eye was dislodged from his socket and had barbed wire tied around his neck. There was clear evidence that pointed to 2 white men who were acquitted in trial. The 2 men later admitted to the killing in a magazine interview, but they were never retried for the crime. Till's mother was upset and outraged for what had happened to her son, and to show the rest of the world the violence that he had to endure in his dying moments, she made the decision to have an open casket funeral. The key concept refers to civil rights activists as responsible for successes in ending segregation. Therefore, this slide introduces some of the most influential civil rights leaders of this time period. They take the mantle from the previous generation that was led by W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Ida B. Wells. The civil rights movement was not a single organization, but instead several organizations working towards the same goal. Some of these organizations, like the NAACP and National Urban League, were founded earlier in the century, but were now led by a new generation of leaders. Some were newly created, such was the case for CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, with one of their founders, James Farmer. Farmer will eventually work in the White House, advising presidents on issues of discrimination. Another group that was newly created was the SCLC, or Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This one may be more recognizable because it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s group. One common characteristic of these groups is that sometimes activists would get their start in one group and go on to form their own based on their goals and views on how to attain equality. This is the case for Ella Baker. She started out in the NAACP, then joined the SCLC at the end of the 1950s, and ultimately co-founded a group called SNCC in 1960. SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The NAACP was led by Roy Wilkins, but there were also other very visible members of the NAACP who worked as field secretaries like Rosa Parks and Medgar Evers. Parks was at the center of the Montgomery bus boycott in Alabama, while Evers led voting registration drives and efforts to integrate various parts of Mississippi. Some of the particular acts of protest he led were wade-ins to integrate the Mississippi beaches. The Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, or LCCR, was created in 1950 by A. Philip Randolph. It was an umbrella group that included the leadership of the NAACP, the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council, and the United Auto Workers. Randolph had suggested a march on Washington during FDR's term to push to implement anti-discriminatory measures in the war industries. His dream for a march was ultimately realized in 1964. The Council of Negro Women was headed by Dorothy Height. Height was cited by other civil rights leaders as an important influence on the movement as a whole. Height is also cited as the first to bring attention to the additional degree of discrimination black women endured for being both black and female. Finally, the National Urban League was another organization that was formed in the early 20th century, but was now led by new civil rights activists. In 1960, Whitney Young, shown on the bottom right, becomes an executive director and through expanded activism and fundraising, made the League a full partner in the civil rights movement. Young will also later work closely with the Nixon administration to get better opportunities for African Americans. The last part of the key concept highlights the successes in ending segregation. One of the first successes was in striking down segregation on transportation companies that engaged in interstate travel. That means that buses that traveled from one state to another were not allowed to have white and black sections of the bus. In 1947, Bayard Rustin organized the first ever freedom ride to test the enforcement of the ruling. Unfortunately, the activists riding the buses were dragged out of the buses and beaten. Despite the Supreme Court ruling, enforcement, especially in southern states, was not carried out. Freedom rides were organized by various groups into the 1960s when the federal government starts to use the Justice Department and U.S. Marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. Another symbol of progress was Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in baseball in 1947. This had been a major league policy going back to the 19th century. In his case, it wasn't activism that pushed the Brooklyn Dodgers to sign him or the league to accept him. It was a superior athletic activity. He paved the way for other black players to sign with other teams, and now suddenly, black players had opportunities beyond the Negro League to play professionally, which actually led to their decline. Another legal success was the court case Sweat v. Painter. It was against the University of Texas at Austin's law school. A black applicant, Heman Sweat, was denied entry because no black students were permitted to register at the university. Sweat's NAACP lawyers, which included Thurgood Marshall, argued that separate but equal could not apply to graduate programs because all black colleges could not logically provide equal accommodations in those programs. So the integration of education in America started at the highest institutions, while grade schools and undergraduate programs would have to wait until 1954. Finally, the Montgomery bus boycott happened from 1955 to 1956. Joanne Gibson Robinson had been an activist that tried to draw attention to the poor treatment of African Americans on the Montgomery bus system as early as 1949. She helped organize a boycott that started as a result of Rosa Parks' arrest after she would not give up her seat on a bus for a white rider. The boycott of the city transportation system lasted 381 days. The black community of Montgomery, Alabama made up 70% of the ridership of the public transportation system, and they were fed up with the discrimination against them. They found other means of transportation until the city and the Montgomery Transportation Authority were willing to integrate the buses. A decision from the Supreme Court ultimately sided with the boycotters in Browder v. Gale. The second key concept of the lecture says the three branches of the federal government used measures including desegregation of the armed services and Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 to promote greater racial equality. The legislative measures refer to the laws passed by Congress. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 that established a Commission on Civil Rights. It was signed by President Eisenhower, who was president at the time. Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a future vice president and president himself, at the time was a major figure in the House of Representatives. He's a top figure in the Democratic Party from the state of Texas and viewed the Civil Rights Bill as a threat to the coalition or electoral strength of the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats didn't want this act to pass or be enforced, so Johnson does a lot to take away some of the provisions that would have made it an effective Civil Rights Act, mainly the components for its enforcement. It's ironic, though, because when he's president in 1964, he signs into law a much more robust Civil Rights Act with more measures of enforcement, and it does ultimately push Southern Democrats to start voting for the Republican Party. The judicial measures from the key concept refer to court decisions from the 1940s and 50s. Some of the major cases were covered in the earlier slides. However, this one covers the case that deals with school desegregation more heavily. Mendes v. Westminster was a federal case in 1947, and it's the first real success in bringing an end to segregation in school. However, it's a Mexican-American family that's at the center of the case. In Orange County, California, the Westminster Unified School District, along with many other school districts in the county, were being sued for segregating Hispanic and Mexican students into what they called the Mexican schools. At these schools, they had the worst level of education, and they were not given the same amount of resources as their white counterparts that were able to go to regular schools. The only reason that students were sent to the Mexican schools was that their last name was Hispanic. So the federal district court that heard the case ruled on the side of the Mendes family, but before the Supreme Court was able to hear the appeal for this case, the governor of California, Earl Warren, signed a law to end segregation in California schools. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, was the next case to challenge education in grade schools. The NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall had been on the team that won Sweat v. Painter and was aware of the Westminster v. Mendes case. He was aware of the argument that was made in order to win the Mendes case at the district court level, and he made a very similar argument to the Supreme Court. He argued that separate facilities were inherently unequal to the segregated class or the segregated group. Marshall and his team presented a lot of scientific evidence about how the segregated class ended up having negative psychological effects instilled in them that they come to view themselves negatively and as inherently bad. The court ruled on the side of Linda Brown, the student at the center of the case, and she then integrated her school in Kansas. Here's other Supreme Court cases that the College Board doesn't mention, but they might be good to remember if you're ever looking to include outside evidence. Smith v. Allwright in 1944 ended the practice of all-white primaries. Political parties in the primary season were able to discriminate against black voters since those elections were not state-run elections. Therefore, when the general election came around, the black voters never had a chance of choosing who would run in the general election. Therefore, all-white primaries were deemed unconstitutional. In Shelley v. Kramer in 1948, it deemed the practice of using restrictive covenants and deeds of homes unconstitutional and unenforceable. A deed is a document that shows ownership in a piece of property, and before this decision, certain restrictions could be written into the deed to prevent the sale of property to a certain group or person. So one way in which white neighborhoods remained white was because homeowners could not sell their houses to anyone who wasn't white if they chose to move. Since the court only ruled that it was unenforceable, any home built before 1948 could potentially have the language of a restrictive covenant in its deed. To remove it, one must go through their county to change the language. The last type of action from the government was executive actions. There are two presidents in this period from the 1940s to the 1950s. They are Truman and Eisenhower. Truman strengthened the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department when he was president. Thus, they were better able to prosecute civil rights cases to try and maintain equality. He ended segregation of the armed forces through Executive Order 9981. Eisenhower was president during the integration of Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas in 1957. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, opposed integration despite the Brown decision. The community in Little Rock was making it difficult for the Little Rock Nine to register and attend classes. Eisenhower then federalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent them to Little Rock in order to protect these 9 students. It created a standoff between the governor and the president. The crisis was heavily covered by the media because it pit the federal government against the state governments. The precedent that Eisenhower set of federalizing the National Guard gets used again in 1963 by President Kennedy to help James Meredith register for classes at the University of Mississippi. Alright, finally here is the recap. Early activism yielded some successes. All branches of government were used to win those gains. That's the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. Truman desegregated the military. That's specifically mentioned by the College Board key concept. And so is the Brown versus the Board of Education court case, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson's separate but equal doctrine.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.